From the EPR Creations studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. This podcast, as always, is brought to you by EPR Creations, by Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and by my newest advertising partner, Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage. As always, information's in the show notes. Let them know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast with Doc Staples. All right, everybody. The time of the week has come for a preview of this weekend's game. And Florida State is going to be playing North Alabama in Doak. And despite FSU being ranked 4th in the latest college football playoff, being 10-0, the quality of opponent is so low that this game will get the CW treatment. So that should tell you kind of how much we really need to spend on this game as a preview. So yeah, this is obviously an FCS team, and honestly, this is not an especially good FCS team. So North Alabama is 3-7, and they're 1-5 in their own conference. And yeah, let's just cut to the chase. They've got a decent quarterback who can run a little bit. And then they've got one wide receiver, Takiri Kennebrew. I think you call it. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Takiri. But yeah, the quarterback, if you go back and you look through some stuff, I went through some of the Chattanooga game, but really didn't want to spend too much time on this. But the quarterback can move, and he throws it pretty well. But he's not he's not going to be on the toward the top of the list of quarterbacks FSU has faced, and they don't have a whole lot up front. Give up a lot of pressure, and yeah, this is going to be a game where he's going to be running for his life a good bit against Florida State. So, and again, a guy that's mobile, can escape pressure well, but he's going to have to be very, very cautious about how he handles this. And honestly, if I'm that coaching staff, I'm telling him to protect himself quite a bit in this game. Kennebrew, the wide receiver, is 6'2" and about 190 pounds, and he's a legit player. He could play in the Power 5, I think, somewhere. I'm not sure he would be more than a number 2 on any team in the ACC, say. I think he's probably a number 3 on some of the kind of mediocre teams in the ACC, but he's a guy that could play FBS football, and he's going to get some looks for some postseason stuff, I would expect. He's had a pretty good year, and he's the one guy you've got to worry about. The one guy that could make some things happen in terms of a big player too. But again, he's going to be going against by far the best set of defensive backs that he's played all season and probably in his career, because they've not actually played a Power 5 team this millennium, I think. So yeah, it's this is a game where, to be quite honest, this is about Florida State, and it's about getting healthy. And if I were Mike Norvell in this game, I'm honestly, given the state of health of this Florida State team right now, and this team has played a lot of very physical football games to this stage of the season, a lot of people don't realize how difficult Florida State's schedule has been up to now. It's been a tough schedule, and not just because of teams that are good teams. There have been some good teams on the schedule, but it's been a lot of physical teams and a lot of teams that play physical football. And yeah, that's led to some guys being banged up at this point. And to be totally honest, this is a game where I would very strongly consider sitting a number of guys, not just early, but maybe for the game. I mean, I would very strongly consider just starting Tate Rodemaker in this game. Maybe have Jordan Travis warm up, something like that. But I'm not sure I'd have Jordan Travis take a snap in this game. I'm just not sure what you get out of it. What more does Jordan Travis or Keon Coleman or Johnny Wilson get out of this game than they do out of a, a hard practice. Honestly, I just don't, I mean, aside from maybe some of the conditioning of being in the game, and, I think you could kind of approach that the way that professional soccer teams do, where you have some guys do some conditioning that day and that's it. The game ends and then those guys stick around for a little bit of conditioning and treatment and then they're done. But this is a game where, if I'm being totally honest here, I'm very strongly considering sitting Jordan Travis for this entire game. Like I said, I just don't know what more he gets out of this game if he plays. And the risk of something, and I mean he's already banged up. I mean, let's just say Miami has some players who are not the cleanest in the world when it comes to, handling themselves in piles and things like that. And I think the extra time of rest is worth a lot more to this team for somebody like Jordan Travis, who's just too important for what you do. He's too good a player. He's too important for this offense to put him at risk for anything in this game. And I think you get a lot out of getting to see what Tate Rodemaker, and I think you try to play all three quarterbacks in this game. I think you get a lot out of seeing what some of the young guys can do. And I think that's good for psychology. That's good for a lot of different things in terms of some of these guys who've not played very much. But I would very strongly consider sitting Jordan Travis to start, Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, any offensive lineman who's banged up right now, and that's several of them. Get them basically out of this game. I mean, if you really feel like the offensive line needs a couple drives, fine, but I don't want to see any of those guys in the second half. I don't want to see any of those guys certainly past the first drive of the second half. But I think a lot of the offensive line, you don't even put them out there. You've got a second group that can blow this team out. And if you can't do that with your second group, that's real concerning. But maybe, if you want to take the risk out of it, you have everybody dress. I think you have everybody dress. But you sit everybody. And if that second group isn't doing their job, then you take the first group and you stick them out there, second quarter or something like that, and you take care of business. But I mean, some people might say that's disrespectful. Some people might say that that's not, how you play this game. Look, if I'm Mike Norvell, I'm here in this game. Yes, I'm here to win the game. I'm here to win this game. But right now, my goals are a lot bigger. And my goals are to go down to Gainesville and win that game. And that's going to be a physical game. That's going to be a war. Florida's not a really good football team this year, but they're a talented team, and they're going to play up to Florida State. It's Florida State. So for my money, I don't want to see Jordan Travis. I don't want to see Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson. I'm fine with Bell, with Javion Bell being out. I'm fine with Benson taking the day off. I'm good with Bless Harris, Verse, Fabian Walker, Farmer, Tatum Bethune, Renardo Green, Fisk. I'm fine with every one of those players not playing a snap in this game. And I'm serious. I just don't see what you get out of it. And I think everybody involved in this game knows that if Florida State plays its second team, they'll still win this game. They should still win this game by 28 to 50 points. And to me, you play Hussey, for example, the entire game, basically at safety. Let him continue to get comfortable in what you're asking him to do. Play all three quarterbacks. And, that doesn't hurt your player development. Right? You've got guys that are excited to be in there who haven't played as much in recent weeks. And they're getting a chance to actually go out and do what they need to do. And you're getting a chance then to coach them on Monday. Getting a chance to coach them in the game. And I think as many young guys as have not played as often. So you're looking at, Vandravius Jacobs. You're looking at Hakeem Williams, if at all possible, if he's available. Goldie Lawrence, guys that have not played a ton. And let Hill and Keziah Holmes carry the load in the backfield. I just think this is one of those games where basically all of your most critical players, those guys start the game on the bench, and they don't come off the bench unless you feel like something has gone wrong and you need them. That's where this game goes. And yeah, I mean, that's what I would do if I'm Mike Norvell. And like I said, some people would potentially criticize about that. Like, you're not showing respect. But I mean, do you really want the extra wear and tear on Tatum Bethune going into Florida? And knowing that after Florida, you've got a really physical Louisville team coming into that ACC championship game. So, yeah, to me, that's what you do. I don't think there's a whole lot of reason not to do it. And I don't know that there's a whole lot more to break down in this game. But to me, that's the sooner you get your starters and especially your key players off the field in this one, the better the win this is for your football team and for your program. And that means some of them just starting on the bench. Now, I do have some time then to discuss some question and answer stuff and some things that have come up. One of the benefits of doing some some film breakdowns and things again is that I'm getting comments on YouTube and other places for this, including some by people who are fans of AU and people who like Miami of Florida, apparently. And let's take a look at this one. This should be called Fanboy Film Breakdown. Totally biased. Apparently doesn't understand that biased has a ED on the end. Biased. Good work. And, of course, my response to that was, well, when one team dominates another, it's hard to make the review sound unbiased. Now, this one's good. It says, come on, it was a good win, not a dominant win. Canes outrushed my FSU by 80 yards. It was the penalties and the non-safety call. Miami definitely more physical. FSU is just better. Oh, man. I just love how Miami of Florida fans... First of all, they're internet fans, right? Because Miami, Florida doesn't have real fans. I love how Miami of Florida fans manage to sustain such impossible levels of optimism. Basically 51 weeks out of the year. They're already on their way to their 23rd consecutive offseason title. They're already off and running about that, about how they've closed the gap with Florida State. If you look at the talent differential on the team, I think in the 24/7 composite, the talent rankings there, if I remember right, Miami's number 9 and Florida State's like number 20 this year. So yeah, I guess the gap is narrowing, just not in the direction that these folks think. And yeah, the fact of the matter is when I went back through that Miami game, it was evident that Florida State was dominant in that game. And the numbers bear this out. I mean, the lowest win expectancy that Florida State had in that game, the lowest win probability in the game was 63.7%. The average win probability in that game was over 80% for Florida State. That's a dominant win. The numbers are very clear. Florida State was a dominant, they controlled that game. And Miami was really fortunate to keep the score as close as they did with a misplayed ball by a safety so bad that it looked almost like point shaving. I'm not alleging point shaving. I'm just saying it was a bad play. But it was a bad play. And without that play, that game's never within 14 points after the, first drive of the after the mid third quarter. It was not a close game. It was a physical game for sure. But when you go back and you look at this, Florida State, a lot of people thought that Florida State lost the battle in the trenches. They didn't lose the battle in the trenches. They played against a team that was close to their equal in the trenches. But you go back through this, Florida State controlled the game even in the trenches. There were times where they had some breakdowns and Miami got some rushing yards, especially toward the end of the second quarter. But through the second half, Florida State dominated the line of scrimmage on the defensive side. Miami couldn't move the football at all in the second half. And in the on the offensive side, Florida State was able to create some running room when they needed to, and Jordan Travis didn't get pressured a whole lot. There were a couple misses by Florida State up front, but they did not get overpowered. They did not get run over by Miami's front. FSU held their own on the offensive line side, and FSU dominated the other side of the line of scrimmage with their defensive line through most of the game. Now, it wasn't as dominant as they've been against some other teams that don't have the talent that Miami does, but it was pretty evident when I went back through that FSU handled things pretty darn well. Now, I did get some questions about why Florida State didn't, run Jordan Travis more in this game. Honestly, I don't think they needed to. And really, the way that they've treated that this year is they're running Jordan Travis as a trump card. That's the card you pull out when the other team shows, okay, like, yeah, they can stop us without that. You look at the fourth quarter against Duke. That's when they sort of unveiled the full offense and said, okay, fine. You know what? Let's deal with this. And then all of a sudden the offense started humming in a way that it hasn't really since the LSU game. And yeah, they're not going to break Jordan Travis out to do that. When they're winning, when they're up by 14 in second half, why would you do that? The best thing you can do is just continue to keep that guy upright and healthy and give yourself a chance the further you advance in the season. Because he's banged up. Let's be honest. He is banged up. So, yeah, anyway. So that's always fun to get those kind of comments. But anyhow, there were some other questions that came in as well. One was on the blown coverage that led to the Miami touchdown. Cypress was playing press, but he didn't jam the receiver. Why play press and not jam? Honest question. I don't know a lot about how that works. And it's a really good question. The main thing here is that Cypress is playing what's called mirror technique off the line of scrimmage. And this is a very common technique at every level where you've got press coverage taught. And the whole design there is to take a leverage position. So he's got inside leverage there. And you're essentially defending your leverage. If he wants to cross your face, if he's going to try to cross your face in that leverage, then you're there and you're going to block him off from that. And then he may get jammed. But if he wants to take the outside release, if he wants to take that, then that's fine. You're willing to give that to him and you're not going to lunge or do anything to reach out and jam him if he goes the direction that you want him to go. Because lunging and all of that puts you in position where you could miss, you can get off balance. He could use that as a way to turn you in a way that is going to take away your leverage. So what you do is you mirror him while maintaining your leverage and forcing him into the release that you want. And if he's going to take that outside release, then as he does that, you just squeeze him from a position on his hip, a lot of times trying to stay just over top of him. Now, given the all the increase of back shoulder throws, you're seeing guys more on the hip rather than over the top of the hip as often as not. But basically you want to squeeze him then to the sideline and you want to shrink the area that the quarterback can throw to. And you're minimizing how many different route options he's got. So that's the basic idea. And then essentially if you squeeze him correctly, all he's got is a vertical of some sort, and it could be, kind of stop and go, it could be a stutter go, that sort of thing. It could be a comeback, could be something along those lines. But if you're squeezing him correctly, you're not even going to have a real out route possibility because it's so thin out there. So essentially you're running a go route, a back shoulder, or a comeback. And you can cover those three from that position pretty well. And you're just trying to make it so that the quarterback and receiver are going to have to be perfect to beat you on something where you're already in position to potentially take it away on the hip, and you just stay there. That's the design. And actually, Cypress was in pretty good position there. If it hadn't been for Knowles coming over the top and taking Cypress out, at worst, you probably have a 30 or 40 yard completion, 35, 40 yard. But Knowles took a bad angle and then realized at the last instant, like, oh shoot, I'm going to take my own guy out instead of getting football. And then you could see he's just trying to jump out of the way and still manages to take his own guy out. And then, that all led to a long touchdown, very fluky long touchdown. So yeah, anyway, that's the reason that you see that. And you're going to see that a lot. It's all about protecting and preserving your leverage. So you're only going to jam essentially if he tries to cross your face, if he tries to take away and go where your leverage, where you're defending. You're willing to let him go somewhere else. And the kind of technique that you're using is similar to the kind of technique that you teach for defending an on the ball in basketball. That's the basic kind of footwork. Your most modern defensive backs coaches are going to teach a kind of almost shuffle out of that. There's a little bit of you can slow pedal it a little bit, but generally it's a little bit of a shuffle, and you're just trying to stay in your mirror position, maintaining your leverage. Wherever your leverage is, you're pretending almost that that's the basketball goal, and you're trying to prevent somebody from crossing you over and being able to get to the cup. That's basically it. So just like in basketball, you're not going to body a guy up if he's deciding to stay outside and go where you want him to go. You just kind of steer him there. But if he's going to try to go through you, then you're going to take that charge. That's kind of how this works for that kind of press coverage. So, yeah. Beyond that, another question that I got, and I think this one's worth spending a little bit of time on, has to do with the offensive line and sort of where Florida State is on that front. So let me go ahead and get this one up. Okay, so this one came from Noah, and he said, offensive line, it's a problem. Doc, it seems like Bless Harris, Mo Smith, and Rob Scott are perpetually injured. It just seems each year we lose key offensive linemen. Do you feel there's enough focus on injury prevention? Is it just bad luck? Are other programs similar with offensive linemen? Imagine if Norvell had Michigan's offensive line. The offensive line to me is what prevents FSU from competing for the national championship. Any of the other three of the team's defensive lines would mail this offensive line and make any sustained offense basically impossible. So first of all, I want to take a look at that last part because I don't think that's necessarily true. So for one thing, I think a lot of people are underestimating how good the defensive lines Florida State has already faced are this season. And I think people also are underrating how good LSU was in that opener as well. People forget how good that LSU team was. Because again, Florida State didn't play the same LSU team that Alabama did. Alabama didn't have to play against Wingo on the inside, who's been LSU's best player on defense. Not actually Perkins and not Mason Smith. Mason Smith hasn't been all that effective this year, but Wingo was really, really good. And he was really good against Florida State. And Clemson, defensive line, pretty good. Miami's defensive line, Miami of Florida's defensive line was excellent, especially for an FCS team. Duke's defensive line, and I know people will go, oh, it's Duke. No, Duke's defensive line is very good. And Florida State handled all those teams fine. Now, are any of those teams Georgia? No, nobody else is. Are any of those teams Alabama? No. But I'm not really convinced that, say, Michigan or Ohio State's defensive lines are that much better than what Miami of Florida's was. So, if you could handle that defensive front, I think you can at least hold your own enough against most of those teams in the playoff to give yourself scoring opportunities. And that's especially true given Mike Norvell and his ability to scheme up all sorts of stuff up front. That's one of the things that he's really creative with, is being able to scheme seams in the running game, to scheme up protection, do all of that. He's really, really good on the protection side and on the finding ways to create creative yards in the running game. They'll find ways against these better defensive lines to find some yardage. Now, by the way, in terms of others, I think Texas has a defensive line that would give Florida State trouble, just like Georgia and Alabama. But Washington does not have that kind of defensive line. Oregon's decent. It's pretty good. But, I think Florida State goes against better defensive lines in practice every day than all but about 3 or 4 teams in the country. And I think they'll do fine against most of those teams, and they'll be able to produce offense even against some of the best defensive lines in the country. And I think they've already done that against several of the teams that have outstanding defensive lines. So that said, I do think it's true that Florida State has a really banged up offensive line right now. And it's true that they were not as effective, say, against Miami or Duke or even Clemson or LSU as they would be if they had found a way to be full strength all season. But they haven't been full strength all season. I mean, Robert Scott has not been healthy since camp. I mean, he wasn't even healthy in camp. And yeah, Bless Harris, Maurice Smith, Robert Scott, even Darius Washington, they've had injury problems. It does seem like, at least three of those guys seem perpetually injured, and they've had injuries multiple years. And yeah, it has been a consistent problem that Florida State's had a lot of those injuries. Now, I don't think that this is a problem in terms of injury prevention or focus on that. It's not just bad luck. And no, it's not how every other program is in terms of offensive linemen. It's mostly a consequence of young guys having to play before they're fully developed and ready to handle a Power 5 workload. If you think about this, Robert Scott, Maurice Smith, Darius Washington, they all had to play as freshmen. And these are not, Evan Neal types where they came in as a freshman, where they're grown men at 18 years old and a little bit more prepared. But even Evan Neal, after playing early, didn't develop quite as well as what you'd hope, and he got banged up a little bit. The thing is, it's hard for me to overstate how physical and how much of a grind this level of football is. And how important, how imperative it is that young offensive linemen become armored up and develop physically first, but also in terms of technique to avoid getting hurt. And honestly, I see this over and over again, not just at Florida State, but wherever you see young guys having to play as true freshmen, and to a lesser extent as, true sophomore, second year guys. But when you see guys playing in their first year in programs, you can pretty much count on those guys getting hurt at some point. And then that's going to impact their overall development because let's say you one of the most common things that happens with young players is just due to the lack of development and lack of armor that you put on in the off season in those early years of development is you get guys that tear up their shoulder. Okay, so you tear up your shoulder. Well, what happens at that point? Let's say you tear up your shoulder in like game 10. All right, so now you're going to have shoulder surgery toward the end of the season. What's your off season going to look like now? Well, January, you're starting to really rehab that surgically repaired shoulder. And during January, you know what you're not doing? You're not training and developing the armor that you lacked when you came in. You're rehabbing that shoulder. You know what you're doing in February? You're still rehabbing that shoulder, and you're now 2 months behind in the training process of armoring up to be ready to play at this level. By the time you get to April, or let's say you get to March, you're starting to get lighter weights and you're starting to finally move into all of that. And then April starts and you're in spring ball. So you're back out there, but you're in a green jersey. You're not really able to go out there and do the work that you need to do to continue to refine your technique and all of that. And you're starting to hit second phase of your rehab. And then you basically only get the summer months. If you're lucky, by the way, this is presuming that, the recovery's gone pretty quickly. You only get a few months in the summer to start armoring up. And then you start over again as a sophomore, and you're 3, 4, 5 months, sometimes 6 months behind because of the rehab that you had to do. And then you know what happens as sophomore? Because you're still behind in terms of your physical development, you get hurt again. You're compensating for some of that stuff that happened before. And, well, you've got other issues in terms of getting banged up on, in other areas where you weren't able to train as heavily. And so by the time you get to be a third year player or fourth year player, you've been hurt 3 or 4 times. And each time you're hurt, it throws your development that much further behind. All because you got forced into action too early. This is why if I had a son who was an offensive line prospect and was a really good one who might be able to play early somewhere, I would be doing everything I could to try to persuade my son to go somewhere where he was not needed to play right away. I'd want to go somewhere where essentially he'd get an opportunity to sit for 2 to 3 years while he's developing, while he's in the weight room during the season. You know, the thing about red shirts, the thing about guys that are playing, you know, maybe 3 games in a given season and then redshirting and they're playing scout team, thing about that is they're doing hardcore in-season training to continue to armor up. So not only if you play early as a freshman, are you missing out on the, you know, say 3 to 6 months of off-season conditioning and strength training because you're rehabbing. You also don't get the in-season training that the red shirts are getting, because you're in the in-season training for players who are playing, which means you can't go as hard in the weight room. So really, you're like 9 months behind in terms of development compared to a guy that redshirts. And that's just huge. So, and that happened to Landon Dickerson. That's happened to Florida State offensive linemen going back to like 2014, where over and over and over again, they'd recruit 4-star offensive lineman. That guy would be forced to play early, and then he'd get banged up. And then he's all of a sudden 9 months behind going into second year, gets banged up again. Now he's 18 months behind where he would have been if he didn't have to play those first couple years. And each time he keeps getting hurt. And that's happened to offensive linemen at Florida State for a decade. This is why it's been so important that Florida State has done so well in the transfer portal to be able to bring in guys like Emmanuel, like Byers, like Keandre Jones, Bless Harris, guys who could step in and allow them to develop the guys that were higher profile guys out of high school, but were not ready to play as true freshmen or as true sophomores. And then next year, you're going to finally start to see some of those guys who are now in position to be legitimate contributors, who've now had 2 years to fully develop up, or 3 years, 4 years in some cases. But you look at a Julian Armella, next year is the year where you ideally want him to start contributing serious repetitions. Jalen Early, next year is the year where ideally, after a couple years of armoring up, now going into year 3, he's ready to start getting some reps. Maybe not ready to be a full-fledged starter, but ready to be in the rotation and to continue to develop. Florida State is finally in position to break the cycle of recruit a young offensive lineman, because you're so thin at offensive line, young offensive lineman has to play early, forced into duty early. Young offensive lineman isn't ready for early duty, so he gets banged up. That getting banged up throws him, 8-9 months behind in terms of his physical development. Also costs him in terms of technique development because he misses time. And then you go into season 2 and rinse and repeat. And then by the time you're looking at season 3 or 4, the guy's either medically redshirted or he's just not developed the way that you would have hoped when he first was recruited. That's been the cycle. Florida State is finally in position to break that cycle next year. Because finally, you're going to be in a position where you're going to have a third-year Julian Armella, a third-year Jalen Early, a fourth-year Thomas Schrader or somebody like that, a fourth-year Bryson Estes, maybe a second-year Andre Otto. I thought maybe he might be a year ahead in terms of his development coming out, but a third-year Kanaya Charlton, depending on how he develops, a third-year Daughtry Richardson, fifth year Darius Washington, or is he going to be a sixth year? A few of these older guys are going to stick around as well. A fifth year Robert Scott, second year Lucas Simmons. You're finally looking at opportunities where you're not needing young guys to come in and play and get hurt. And yeah, you say, okay, well, Bless Harris, what about him? You're looking at a guy who came in after he was a third year player when he came in out of FCS. He didn't get developed there. He came in and was a little ahead of where a true freshman would be, but he still, if you looked at him physically, it was potential, but he did not have the armor that you're seeing on the GAMs, the grown men that come in and are, 22 years old, or 21 years old, and have been in a college FBS weight program along with the college FBS nutrition program for 3 or 4 years. He wasn't that. And then what happened? He tore his shoulder up. This is what happens. That's where Florida State's been. That's been a huge issue for them. And it's not going to be an issue, I don't think, after this year. You're not going to see some of those guys that were recruited really heavily just not pan out because they got banged up when they were younger. And again, guys like Scott and Washington and Smith, to a lesser degree, Bless Harris, these are guys that got banged up because they were asked to play at this level, to go through that grind without really being armored up and equipped for it. And they're not going to have to do that a bunch now. I mean, next year you're looking at a starting lineup probably of Robert Scott, Jalen Early, Darius Washington, Maurice Smith, and Jeremiah Byers or something like that. Or, let's try that again. Maybe Robert Scott on the left side, Byers at left guard, Maurice Smith at center, maybe. You've got Keandre Jones, you've got Darius Washington, you've got Jalen Early. All of those guys could play in there. You got Julian Armella at right tackle, maybe a Jalen Early at right tackle. You got options there. And some of those guys are some of the younger guys now. And some of those guys are older guys that, again, if Washington and Smith are able to get through the rest of this year and Robert Scott's able to get healthy over the offseason, you're going to get guys that are finally going to be, late in their career and be ready to go after having finally gotten some development late in their career. So that's huge. But again, I think they'll be able to play against some of the best defensive lines, even in the playoff, partly because Norvell does such a great job scheming that up, partly because they're going to, no matter who they play, those teams are going to have a hard time dealing with Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson and Jaheim Bell and, some of the freaks. And so that's going to open up the box still some. And then you combine that with some scheme, and they'll find ways to be able to do some things up front, enough to be a real threat, to have a puncher's chance in any of those games, and maybe more than a puncher's chance. Other thing you got to remember is, as banged up as this Florida State offensive line is, they're going to be a lot less banged up if they're able to make it to the playoff, because they're going to get some time to recuperate and spend some time in the training. So, they just have to get through the next 3 weeks. They got to get through the University of Florida, and then they got to get through the ACC championship game. You get through those 2 weeks, you survive those 2 weeks, and you get to the training room, and you get a lot healthier up front. And all of a sudden, this looks like a much more dangerous team because they're healthier going into some of the, the best defensive lines that they've played. Oh, and by the way, they're going to get Darrell Jackson. Florida State's defensive line gets a whole new lease on life when Darrell Jackson gets added to that rotation. And they're going to get Dennis Briggs back. Folks have forgotten Dennis Briggs hasn't even played the last few weeks. He's been banged up. So you go into the playoff, and, Florida State's been weakest stopping the run compared to certain other things this year. I mean, they've been dominant against the pass. Where they've had their weaker area has been against the run. All of a sudden, you add Darrell Jackson to that defensive tackle rotation. Now your defensive tackle rotation is Fisk, Farmer, Jackson, and Lovett as your first four. And then you're rotating in Dennis Briggs. Yeah. That's going to be a much harder. That's going to be a much more difficult team to run on for some of the teams that the question mentioned than you'd think. I mean, Michigan is not going to just be able to line up and push Darrell Jackson, Fabian Lovett, Joshua Farmer, and Braden Fisk off the ball. FSU will be able to match up player for player up front with some of those guys. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to win that game if that game's played. But it does mean that they are going to have the personnel to be able to hang with those teams. That's the thing you got to remember. This Florida State team, as banged up as they are right now, if they survive and get into the playoff, they're going to be that much more dangerous once they get to the playoff, because you're going to have a healthy Johnny Wilson, a healthy Keon Coleman, much healthier Jordan Travis, much healthier on the offensive line, might even be able to get the offensive line that you wanted to start the season with by that point. And then you're getting Darrell Jackson back on the interior. And nobody's seen this defense with Darrell Jackson, and it's going to be a revelation. That, by the way, brings us back to how I started the show. That's why in this game against North Alabama, what do? If there's a player who's not 80% or better in terms of how he's feeling, in terms of physical health, you hold him out if he's an important player. And if he's one of your top guys, one of your true, really important guys, Jordan Travis, Johnny Wilson, Trey Benson, Keon Coleman, maybe throw Jaheim Bell in there, a couple of the offensive linemen, Fisk, Lovett, Farmer, Bethune, maybe Renardo Green, Akeem Dent. Some of these guys, Jared Verse, you look at those guys and you go, you know what? You take the week off. You're not even starting this game. That's why. It's a banged up team. You just need to get through the 2 weeks following this. And then all of a sudden you were a really dangerous football team against teams that are not going to want to play against what you're putting out on the field with some of the freaks. And then you got a chance. No, you're not as talented top to bottom as Alabama or Georgia or Michigan or Ohio State. You're not. But out of those teams, only Ohio State has anybody like Keon Coleman. And they don't have a Jordan Travis. And they don't have a Johnny Wilson to go with Keon Coleman. And, you know, when you put Darrell Jackson out there, Florida State, in terms of defensive line, is on par. They're parity with, say, Ohio State and Michigan, I think. I think Georgia and Alabama still probably hold the edge there, but not by a ton. Not with you put just starter for starter, Peyton versus Darrell Jackson, Joshua Farmer out there, or add Braden Fisk and Fabian Lovett in terms of that rotation. You know, even Alabama and Georgia are not miles ahead of that group. They do have better edges for, number 2 edge. They've got some backers that you'd trade for. Definitely better at the safety position. But in terms of some of these guys are guys that you can compete for a real national title with. Just got to get healthy once you get past the ACC title game, and that means getting through the next 3 weeks. And that means you got to be healthy as healthy as possible coming out of the North Alabama game and going into Gainesville. And that'll do it for us here. I'll talk to you guys at some point after the North Alabama game. I will be out of town at a professional conference for my other job. There's a major review panel of the book that I have getting. It's officially coming out. Its official release date is November 23rd, and there is an international book panel reviewing that book. It's actually kind of a big deal to go all anchorman on this, that I'll be doing out there this weekend. And that review panel's Monday morning. So when I actually get anything in after North Alabama, I'm not sure. It may not come immediately after that game. Hot takes may be a little cooler, and probably won't get to turn to do some Florida stuff until around midweek. But until then, until the next time, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media. and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.